Picture this. It's your weekly D&D game. Your party is traveling back to the nearby capital city after having taken on a quest that involved exploring some nearby ruins and rooting out some cultists that were causing trouble. You walk in the midday sun, proud of the job you've done and looking forward to the rewards you've been promised. As you walk, the sun suddenly goes black and a horrendous screech rings out. Bursting forth from the blackened sun, you see a creature swiftly approaching your party. Even just looking at this creature boggles the mind as you're overwhelmed with the mixture of fear, but also admiration and a desire to approach this creature. But to be fair, not many could look long upon an Eldritch Archangel, let alone one that has come to fight. Hello! It's time for another D&D Monster Mashup. This is a series where I take two D&D monsters, slap those babies together, and see what I can come up with. This is one of the weeks where I let myself pre-pick my monsters, and so I started racking my brain about what exactly I wanted to use. Ultimately, I landed upon, first, a Mind Flayer. This is one of my favorite monsters in D&D because it's one of the only real D&D monsters that feels Lovecraftian and eldritch in its very nature. I find that D&D in general lacks a lot of eldritch entities, particularly very powerful eldritch entities. And so, by using a Mind Flayer, I was hoping to fill that gap. But the question remained, what exactly to mix that with? Well, another area I find lacking in D&D is the Celestials. In total, there are only around 30 Celestials in the official source books. Meanwhile, things like devils, demons, the fiend category as a whole has too many for me to have counted. So I looked through the Celestial list, and I've decided that for this video, my Mind Flayer is going to be mixed with a Solar. Solars are the most powerful angel in D&D. Typically, they serve a god, and there are only 24 known to exist. And so by mixing the Solar with the Mind Flayer, I have created the Eldritch Archangel. Eldritch Archangels are aberrations, but they're aberrations that serve specific eldritch entities or eldritch deities, depending on your game and your setting. Their primary purpose is to further the mission of that eldritch entity that they serve, and to spread knowledge and awareness of the eldritch entity, because typically the way eldritch entities work is that they can extend greater influence simply by people becoming aware of them. In fact, in a lot of cases, becoming aware of eldritch entities can even spread madness amongst the population. And so the Eldritch Archangels are looking to do just that. Eldritch Archangels have psychic powers rivaled only by the deities that they serve. They're true masters of psionics. And just looking at one of these creatures can send you into a deep madness, a madness in which you perceive the Eldritch Archangel as a being to be loved and worshipped, and where you want nothing more than to get close to it. But the moment you get close to it, it's going to wrap its tentacles around you and forcibly convert you into a follower of its deity. But how exactly does the Eldritch Archangel accomplish these tasks? Well, for that, it's time we look at the stat block. Now, this is going to be a chunky stat block, so I need you to bear with me here. First up, the boring bits. This is a CR22 monster, so it's likely something that'll be fought alone by a party, or if it does have allies nearby, likely they'll be low-level kind of minions. I went with an AC of 20 and an HP of 300, and I made its mental stats its highest stats, with int being the highest out of 30. Its physical stats are all still above 10, but they are significantly lower than its mental stats. This, combined with the fact that it only has proficiency in mental saving throws, really gives players a weakness they can exploit in battle by forcing things like strength, dex, or con saving throws. Now, the Eldritch Archangel does have a lot of skill proficiencies, just like the Mind Flayer. It makes sense they'd be a master of things like Arcana and History, things that are directly related to the kind of eldritch entities that they follow. Now, even though this creature isn't a Celestial, it is still an Archangel of sorts, and so I decided to give it resistance to radiant damage. And because it's a master of psionics, it has full-blown immunity to psychic damage, which oddly enough, a Mind Flayer does not have. In fact, Mind Flayers don't even get resistance to psychic damage for some reason, but I digress. The Eldritch Archangel's mental fortitude also causes it to be immune to charmed and frightened effects. And since this creature is part solar, I decided to give it immunity to both the exhausted and poisoned conditions. It has true sight just like a solar does, but I dropped the radius to 120 feet. In D&D, 150 foot just doesn't come up as much as 120 feet, so even though there's no real big difference between 120 versus 150 feet of true sight, it still just felt better to me. And lastly, just like a solar, the Eldritch Archangel knows all languages and communicates via telepathy. Now let's move on to the fun stuff and talk about this creature's abilities. So notably, I opted not to give it the legendary resistance ability. I do think that legendary resistances fit the theming of this monster, but ultimately its other abilities and legendary actions are so powerful that I felt that if it did have the legendary resistances, it would just be a skosh too difficult for players to face, but you could easily add those back in should you choose. As for the 4 abilities I did choose to give it, first up we have Incomprehensible. This is the ability that enables the Eldritch Archangel to inflict that particular type of madness I described earlier. The way it works is that any creature that starts its turn within 60 feet of the Eldritch Archangel must first make a choice. That choice is, do you avert your gaze or do you not avert your gaze? If you choose to avert your gaze, all of your actions against the Eldritch Archangel will be at disadvantage, and you can't do anything that requires sight. However, you will be immune to the sort of madness effect that I'm about to describe. If you do choose to look at the Eldritch Archangel and do not avert your gaze though, you're going to need to make a wisdom saving throw. On a success, nothing happens to you, but on a failure, you've become charmed by the Eldritch Archangel. While charmed in this way, you want nothing more than to approach the Eldritch Archangel, and you're going to use everything in your power to get as close to it as quickly as possible. And importantly, you do not want to hurt it. The charmed effect will last until you're within 5 feet of the Eldritch Archangel, but anything that explicitly states it can end the charmed condition can end this before you are within 5 feet of the Eldritch Archangel. The Eldritch Archangel's second ability is its innate spell casting. I chose spells that reflected that reality-breaking, psionic theming of an eldritch entity. So you'll see things like Reality Break and Feeble Mind on this list. Now for the third ability, I decided to take something directly from the Solar, that being Knowledge from Beyond. This ability makes it so the Eldritch Archangel will know if a lie is spoken in its presence. So your party isn't going to get away with deception checks against this thing. And lastly, magic resistance. A lot of high CR creatures have magic resistance, so it only felt natural to give it to the Eldritch Archangel as well. Moving on, let's look at the Eldritch Archangel's actions. Aside from casting spells in battle, the Eldritch Archangel is going to fight primarily by summoning psychic swords. These psychic swords are inspired in part by an ability that the Solar has, and in part by the dancing greatsword item that exists in D&D. The way it works is that the Eldritch Archangel summons up to 3 psychic swords anywhere within 90 feet of it. When a psychic sword is summoned, it can make an attack with that psychic sword upon any creature within 5 feet of it, and the Archangel can move all of the swords using its bonus action. There are no limits to the number of psychic swords that can be on the battlefield, but they can be targeted by players for attacks. Every psychic sword has its own AC of 20, and they have a single hit point worth of health, meaning you just gotta hit them and they'll go away. Furthermore, when attempting to target the psychic swords, you treat them as if they're being held by the Eldritch Archangel, meaning let's say a player decides to try and grab one out of thin air. They're going to need to make a contested check against the Eldritch Archangel to try and grab it as if they're grabbing it from its grip. Or let's say they cast heat metal on the psychic sword. That Eldritch Archangel is still going to take damage as if it were touching that psychic sword. Instead of summoning psychic swords, an Eldritch Archangel can also use its action to make a multi-attack with the existing psychic swords out on the battlefield. It can make 1 attack per sword on the battlefield, so long as each of those swords is within 90 feet of it. As for the Eldritch Archangel's last action, we have Bestow Fervor. Bestow Fervor goes hand in hand with the Incomprehensible ability I described earlier. What this does is, if there is a creature within 5 feet of the Eldritch Archangel, it lashes out with one of its tentacles, wrapping it around the head of the individual in front of it. Doing so inflicts damage on the individual, and they need to make a DC 21 Wisdom saving throw. If they fail that saving throw, they become enamored with the Eldritch entity that this Eldritch Archangel serves. What that means is that they are essentially now an ally of the Eldritch Archangel and will take its commands. Mechanically speaking, this fervor is another version of the charmed condition. So, for the first minute that a creature has this fervor within it, it is able to break that charmed condition via spells like Calm Emotions and Greater Restorations like I mentioned earlier, and it can also remake the saving throw anytime it takes damage in combat. If a minute passes and this creature is still charmed, that fervor becomes semi-permanent and can only be removed by Greater Restoration or Wish. Even death doesn't remove the fervor. A player could kill their ally and then resurrect them, and they will still have fervor for that entity. Even if the Eldritch Archangel that bestowed the fervor dies, the person in question still has it. And in fact, they'll obey commands from other followers of the Eldritch entity, things like warlocks or other Eldritch Archangels. Lastly, legendary actions. The Eldritch Archangel has 3 options for legendary actions. The first is a teleport legendary action. This just lets it move up to 120 feet to a point in range that it can see. The second legendary action is that it can make a single attack with one of its psychic swords. But third, and most fun in my opinion, is called Psychic Pull. The way this works is that every creature of the Eldritch Archangel's choice within 60 feet of it needs to succeed on a DC 21 strength saving throw. On a success, nothing happens. But on a failure, they are pulled up to 60 feet closer to the Eldritch Archangel. That way, it can wrap a tentacle around their heads as well and bestow fervor. Now, with the stat block in mind, let's talk encounter design and combat strategies. As I mentioned earlier, it's likely that the Eldritch Archangel is going to be fighting alone. However, if it's not fighting alone, then you should only really pair it with lower level minions, things like low level cultists, or even maybe some Mind Flayers. If the Eldritch Archangel is going to be battling your players by itself, I recommend surprising them a little bit with this fight. You don't necessarily have to get a true surprise round. I'm not expecting stealth here. I'm more thinking something like the scenario that I described when I opened this video. Something where your players unexpectedly see the sky turn black and the entity just appears in front of them. If, however, the Eldritch Archangel is going to be fighting with allies, I would recommend giving your players the opportunity to scout things out and come up with a plan. Something where maybe they can infiltrate a camp and scout things out and see the Eldritch Archangel and see all of the other forces, or things where they can set up traps. Just some things that your players have a little bit of agency in a fight that large and difficult. Regardless of how you actually design your encounter though, the Eldritch Archangel is going to have the same priorities and a very similar battle strategy. When fighting as an Eldritch Archangel, remember that your primary goal is to bestow fervor on as many people as possible. This means that your Eldritch Archangel isn't going to be trying to actually kill most of your players. That's not to say it's not going to knock them unconscious, because an unconscious person can still be charmed. But a dead person is of no use to them. Also, because it's going to prioritize bestowing fervor, you should also make sure you use Psychic Pull every single round of combat. That being said, this is a high-int creature. Even though it can psychically pull in as many targets as it wants, it likely isn't going to pull in more than one or two at a time, so that it can't get flanked or ganged up on by enemy attacks. But if there's a round where your entire party is more than 60 feet away from the Eldritch Archangel, that's the point at which it's going to start using its spells and psychic swords. Speaking of spells, here's a little bit of a warning. I wouldn't use Feeble Mind right away in combat. In fact, you might not even use it at all depending on how your players are doing in the combat. Feeble Mind can be a very punishing spell, and so I wouldn't use it early on. And if you're going to use it, only use it on a player who's been a real thorn in this creature's side. Someone who has made a bunch of saving throws or done a bunch of damage, who this creature really needs to incapacitate. It's a fine line you have to walk between being in character as this monster, but also making sure that the fight is fun for your players. And I think if you throw Feeble Mind out too early or too willy-nilly, it's just not going to have the payoff you want. As for Psychic Swords, the Eldritch Archangel is a very intelligent creature, and so it's likely going to make sure it has at least one sword per enemy out on the battlefield at any given point in time. Furthermore, it's likely going to keep a couple swords summoned around itself as a form of protection at all points in time. The only other important thing to keep in mind is that this is a very intelligent creature, and it's going to fight as such. If it looks like the creature's going to die, it's instead going to flee. If it looks like there are too many enemies nearby, it's going to move. As a DM, using this creature is a wonderful opportunity for you to flex that strategic part of your brain and come up with all the possible ways you can counteract your player's abilities. Being that it's so smart, it's going to learn on the fly. It's going to notice who your spellcasters are, who your melees are, who are your squishiest characters, which characters are the biggest pain in the ass. It's going to notice everything and act accordingly. All that being said though, that is the end of the Eldritch Archangel. Thank you so much everyone for watching. It is always appreciated. I was originally planning on releasing these videos once a week. Clearly that has not happened given that it's been about a month between each of these videos, but I'm trying. Life's just been very busy right now. But if you want to see more videos like these, my last Monster Mashup video is in the card up above, and you can always like and subscribe to be notified of future uploads. And if there are any monster combos you want to see in a future Monster Mashup video, leave them in the comments down below. Who knows, it might end up in the next video. Again, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you next time. Bye-bye!